This is a murder mystery. Uh, Even Midsummer Murders couldn't repeat this one. Wayne Druitt was a bit of an entrepreneur, a bit of a Walter Mitty, nice guy, but always, I've got this going on, and so on. He was undertaking some diamond deal with an unknown person called the facilitator. No one knew his identity. He wanted to keep his identity secret. So after 48 hours, he hadn't appeared. The car was found that night just outside the surveillance area of the Perth airport. Alarm bells are ringing straight away. These weird, crazy type of jobs where people would think only would happen on TV. They'd saw through the bars. 3 of them got through the window, across the roof. They had civilian clothes underneath. From there, they got on a bus, went and got a hamburger from Hungry Jack's, and then continued on their merry way. It was regarded as a high-risk job. And when we went into the flat, there he is. He's sitting in front of a TV. The TV's just running on static now. And there's a great big hole in his head. Everybody thought this was a murder. And then digging around, one of the informants said that, before he did a job, he played Russian roulette.
Today, I had a great chat with a former Western Australian police officer, Detective Senior Sergeant Glen Potter. Glen led the investigation into one of Australia's most wanted criminals, Brenden Abbott, who is also known as the Postcard Bandit. Abbott was a notorious armed robber who escaped from prison twice. He was on the run for years and was believed to have robbed between 40 to 50 banks. Glen spoke about how the Postcard Bandit was eventually caught and the game of cat and mouse between him and Brenden trying to track him down. This investigation is currently being portrayed on a TV series called Run. You should check it out, it's a great show. But that's just one of many of Glen's stories from his amazing career in the Western Australian Police. We also talked about his role as a police negotiator and his involvement in Australia's longest running hostage situation. Wait until you hear that story, it's a cracker of a police story. We talked about tactical policing and dramatic arrests, including the investigation into the disappearance of a former soldier who was caught up in an international diamond fraud with links to Romania. Glen also tells me about the worst injury he got as a policeman, which was whilst riding a horse, which is quite ironic given the fact he's also an accomplished rodeo rider. Some of the stories Glen's got you won't believe, but you just can't make this shit up. I hope you enjoy. Glen Potter, welcome to I Catch Killers.
G'day, Gary. Happy to be here.
When you joined the police, I'm sure you didn't have an expectation that there'd be a TV series playing out about an investigation you were involved in. What was that like? Was that a sort of surreal experience for you?
It was, but I'd built up over a number of years with the intention of getting into the movie industry, during and after I retired. And as you and I had discussed previously, I worked with animals, horses. I've been a horse rider all my adult life, and I wanted to take horses to film. And so I got into the industry through acting lessons, and it just evolved from there.
Yeah, that's a interesting side hustle,
Yeah.
training animals and in the police. But you actually, and we'll talk about it later in the podcast, you were involved in the horses when you were in the police.
Yeah, look, I decided to go for a career change about 25 years into the job. I was a detective senior sergeant, and I decided that I'd give something different a crack, and I was asked to take over the mounted section to try and fix some of the problems there. And in the end, I had 15 years there and with the dog squad as well, traveling the world, talking about mounted policing all through the world. So it was quite surreal, that alone. And of course, I got to meet people like Heath Harris, who was responsible for the horses and things like Gallipoli and a man from Snowy River and so on, a famous horse trainer.
Yeah.
And that was through the police because New South Wales police were using him to train their police horses.
Right. Okay.
And I thought, that's a good gig. I'm going to have a crack at this. And I did.
Well, it's nice having a fallback position after the police. Like we enjoy the police, but you never know where that's going to take you or when it's time to leave. So a good thing to have a backup. The actual TV series we're talking about, Run, related to Brenden Abbott. For people that don't know Brenden Abbott, he escaped from prison twice. I think he escaped from a police station once before that. Um, was on the run for years. Bank robber, the notorious bank robber, and at the peak of his activity, he was probably Australia's most wanted man. We're going to talk about that investigation and your involvement in the investigation, but just to give the listeners an understanding about who Brenden was as a person, how would you describe him? Because he had such a high profile.
Brenden was a thoughtful criminal, and I underline criminal. From a young age, he'd gone through a series of issues with family. He was made a ward of estate um, by his mother, put him up for a warden of the state. He went into a boys' home. That's where he learnt his trade. At 18, he started committing, your normal petty offences. But he was also a little bit more organised than most. He initially took on stealing electrical goods from shops and reselling them at a bit of a side hustle. And from there, he was pulled in by the detectives at Nollamara CIB, and that's when he made his first escape through the back door of the police station. From there, he went on to bigger and better things and eventually went on to become the drop-in bandit. He took on a bank and dropped through the ceiling of a bank. That hadn't been done in WA before. That created the initial start of the myth behind the man. And ultimately, he was arrested at Perth Airport and charged with the robbery, got a sentence, and then that's when things really kicked off.
Okay. I hear what you're saying, and watching the documentary and reading up about Brenden, and it's not glorifying crime. We know from being police officers the impact those type of crimes can have. But there was something about him in the way that he carried out the crimes, and we'll delve into that because I think it's very interesting you talking about the investigation and how he was eventually caught. But let's learn, before we go into that, let's learn a little bit about yourself. Where did you grow up?
Um, in Perth and a little bit in the northwest. I initially wanted to join the army,
Yep.
and that's all I wanted to do. And I got as far as almost accepted into apprenticeship school at 15 when my father, who had served in the Navy, said, "You're not going, you're too young." So he canned that. And I said, "Well, what am I going to do? Can I join the police?" He said, "Sure." So at 15, I applied for the police. I got in as I just turned 17
Yep.
as a cadet. Um, and then spent the next few years bouncing around doing different jobs till I decided what I wanted to do. I spent some time in the pipe band because I played the bagpipes as a kid.
Oh, of course you
So
did. You ride horses, play the bagpipes, you do all sorts of things. You're a
um,
negotiator. Yeah.
so yeah, I did a couple of years in the pipe band, and then I decided I'll give traffic a go and tour around on my motorbike and love that. And then I got into an investigative section in the traffic branch, which was run by an old ex-detective sergeant. And he said, "I think you should be a detective." So he arranged for me to go and see the chief super of the CIB at the time. Probably the most harrowing interview I've ever done. I didn't realize it was an interview. I went in
Yeah.
there and he just hammered me for about 40 minutes, made me say something silly about letting a shoplifter um, be summoned.
Yep.
And he hammered me for that. Then he threw the criminal code at me and said, "Now find arson." And I'd been given a tip on what to do when he said find arson.
Yeah.
Never go to the front, go to the back.
Yeah.
So I went to the back, found arson, answered the questions, stood up and thought, "I've really blown this interview. I'm never going to be a detective." Shook his hand, said thanks for the moment, went back to the office. By the time I got back to the office, old Jack Deering had run Bill, my boss, and said, "He's a good fella. We're going to take him.
Yep.
Just tell him he's joined the CIB." And I went, far out.
Wow.
So that's how my life as a detective started that way.
What year was that? What where
That was, that
being
was
that?
1985.
Okay. That's we had something similar in New South Wales. If you wanted to become a detective, you had to pass what they call the bull ring, and I think it was aptly, called the bull ring for a reason because you'd have three old cranky detective sergeants sitting at a table opposite you, and like it sounds like what you went through, put the pressure on you, just see how you're going to react. just really stir you up, and how you come across that dictates whether you get the invite in to become a detective or plain clothes.
I think had I'd not been told about the index on the
Yeah.
criminal code, I probably would have been in traffic for a very long time.
Well, it's handy to have informants, isn't it?
Oh
A
yeah, I
little
learnt
bit,
very early in those days.
yeah, a little bit of inside knowledge. That might have been part of the test. You also got into, and I want to break it all down, but just again to give you a sense, the listener a sense of the diversity of work that you've done within the police. Negotiating, you were a negotiator at some stage.
I was. At the same time as becoming a detective, I was also what we had a part-time emergency squad, which became the TRG,
Yep.
which is, the tactical group. So I was an operator in that, and we were off doing courses and that type of thing. And I saw negotiators, and I thought, yeah, that's pretty cool. So I made the choice to become a detective,
Yep.
and then eventually gave the tactical side up when that became full time, and then later on became a negotiator, a hostage negotiator,
Yeah.
and yeah, went to Queensland, did all the courses, and ended up some pretty fascinating jobs for as a negotiator um, uh, in WA.
Yeah, you were telling me about one that you're involved in that I want to touch on later on in the podcast, but it was particularly interesting. When you were looking at the Brenden Abbott case, how did you get involved in that? At what stage of your career was he first came across your radar?
I was in 79 Division about 19, between 92 and 94, and I was a detective senior constable, and that 79 Division was crime cars. So you 90% of your time you're working nights and roving around the metropolitan area. They used to have four detective cars, or 79 Division, one uniform, one detective, permanent partners,
Mm.
roaming around the city, and it was fantastic. It was just excitement every night. It was, and 79 Division was that was the go-to crew for the night if you had a
Yeah.
major crime. We do the initial stuff. From there, I got promoted to detective sergeant, and so I had to leave,
Mm.
and I got sent to armed robbery squad.
Right.
Um, so from there, I went to 4 years at armed robbery, and I took over a team of three guys and myself, and of course, all the files for that team were just landed on my desk, and I was just going through the files, and I came across one that said Operation Elmer Fudd,
Yeah.
and that's what they called it, and that
Yep.
was into Brenden Abbott, and this was 5 years after his escape.
Okay.
So I'd been on the run. They'd been chasing him around the country trying to get, leads on him. But really, in those days, the states were very siloed. They would only kind of be interested in what they were
Wouldn't
doing,
share intel or
unless you were doing interchange
yeah.
between squads, which at that stage had since ceased. So there wasn't much sharing. So I mean, I'm reading Operation Elmer Fudd, which was about Brenden Abbott,
Mm.
and it sparked a memory of mine while I'd been in 79 Division, which is that I had been, we went to a domestic, violent domestic, and I was talking to a woman there by the name of Kelly Fisher, who was the de facto of Glenn Salmon, aka Glen Abbott, which
Yep.
was the younger brother
Brother.
of Brenden Abbott. And she was pretty angry with Glenn at the time, and she started telling us stuff. And she said, "Oh, he was over east, and I reckon he was with his brother, Brenden Abbott, between such and such dates." And that sparked a memory because when I was reading through the files,
Mm.
and as the investigation went on, a gun shop robbery came up in in the Gold Coast, and it was near the Pink Poodle Hotel. And those things clicked: the timing, the fact that it was maybe suspected that Brenden was involved with that.
Yeah.
So I changed tact on the investigation, which was initially focusing on informants and the family here, uh, the whole family, to focusing on Glenn, because to me that was a proven connection.
It's not a bad way to run or focus an investigation if that's a connection. And I assume you're working on the belief that as two brothers they had a bond and they would likely meet up at some stage.
Well, that's right. And the other thing that sparked my interest, obvious, is that we couldn't find him.
Yeah.
We could not find Glenn Salmon anywhere. We didn't know where he lived. We eventually we found a Glen Norman Salmon, um, working in in a factory in Bayswater. So for the next week, we set surveillance up until we realised that this was a different Glen Norman salmon.
Yeah.
It wasn't our guy. Um, so we just continued on trying to find him. We got a lucky break. We got some information that the Glen salmon we were looking for was appearing in court in Mandurah for a driving offence. So we set up on that date, and sure enough, we picked him up and we conducted surveillance on him, and we found he was living covertly in Mandurah, which is south of
Yeah.
Perth, um, under a false name, false rental agreement, false bank, false everything,
Mm.
completely covert.
Okay.
And so that was our focus. We started working on him very closely, surveillance, or as much as the surveillance we could get on him. Um, and we worked through our tactics of what we were going to do to try and see whether he linked up with Brenden,
It's
which became a story on its own.
the way you talk surveillance, and it was a different ball game back then, wasn't it? A lot of physical surveillance. We didn't have the technology tracking phones as much as available today, and it was easier in a cash society to go off the radar and not track people. So I would imagine when you found the hideout that Glenn had, or where he was off the records, that would have felt like a good step in the right direction.
Oh, look, we knew we were onto something. And I
Yeah,
was at this stage talking to both Sid Thomas in South Australia
yep,
and Jerry Costello in Queensland, and ultimately then Glenn Pritchard, who was a detective on the Gold Coast. And can I add, throughout this investigation, even before the 5 years before
mm,
me, a lot of credit must go to the guys who were doing the previous
yeah,
investigation. A lot of credit to Sid Thomas and a lot of credit to Jerry Costello, who were detective sergeants
yeah.
in their respective jurisdictions. So it wasn't a one man, one team, one state job. And by this stage, we'd got up a better communication between
Yeah,
states.
yeah. Um, Tell us about the first breakout from Fremantle Prison, just so people have got a sense of what we're dealing here with Brenden Abbott, because it's pretty ballsy, as most prison breaks are, because the consequences are, if it goes bad, that they can be shot, as the corrective services are entitled to do. How did he break out of Fremantle? I've been to Fremantle Prison, and those that don't know it, it's a very old style prison, the way you'd expect something from the previous century: sandstone
Yep.
blocks and iron bars. How did he actually break out of there?
Um, so to take a step back, there was a prison riot, and Brendan was one of the people involved in the riot, and ultimately had to uh, face court with a number of other defendants, and they were going to and from court, high security, every day during the trial. And this is important because Brendan was they'd take off their prison greens, they would put on um, civilian clothes. They'd be taken to the prison, come back, strip off. And over that period, he was able to accumulate some civilian clothes. Obviously, he'd take one item every now and then, and he stashed those away. So he was always thinking about
Planning.
escape. Um, so we move along post the prison riot trial. He's convicted. He's got extra time on his sentence. He got himself into the prison tailor shop where they were making uniforms, prisoners' gear, overalls, and this type of thing. And I think it dawned on him very early that he couldn't just tunnel out. He couldn't go out just over the wall. He couldn't walk out. So he had to come up with a pretty devious plan.
Mm.
And the plan he came up with was to look like get out of the tailor shop through the bars, get across the roof and over the wall. He had a pretty good idea of the setup of the prison because during the course of the trial, there were maps shown of the prison, and obviously he took those in. So he knew roughly where he had to go to get out over the wall, and the tailor shop gave him that access. So he'd managed to secure getting hold of a hacksaw blades through the workshop there, and he'd also managed to to get on to making overalls. And at one stage, they'd had the overalls stashed away and made, and they were cutting through the bars over a long period. But one of the bars broke early. So they made the decision to go there and then. That was him, Reynolds, and a guy called, I actually can't remember his surname, the
Yep.
other one, but um, So they were going to do to get out. They'd saw through the bars. Three of them got through the window, across the roof. They had to jump a gap. Reynolds and Abbott got over the gap, and the third one fell down the gap and broke his leg. So they continued on this gap through the roofs, over the wall. They dropped a big drop and scarpered, getting rid of the overalls.
Yeah.
They had civilian clothes underneath. From there, they got on a bus and went and got a hamburger from Hungry Jack's, and then continued on their merry way. And
Just
Abbott ran for 5 months, 5 years.
breaking down a couple of things. The jump, the gap, like prisons are set up not to escape. So I would imagine it's a pretty big gap and consequences if you fail that gap. But I suppose if you're trying to bust out of prison, you're highly motivated.
Yeah. And look, they had a good run up to it, and they got across. And of course, one of them
Yeah,
didn't quite make it. I think it was quite a gap.
yeah,
And of course, the prison guards are seeing people in what they initially thought were overalls, prison overalls, as prison officers.
mm.
So they got a fair distance before it was realised that they were escaping prisoners. So it was pretty ingenious.
Yeah. And the fact that the planning, because in the people I've spoken to or I know that have escaped from prison, you tend to have two types: ones that are planning it, and ones that are opportunistic. That
Yeah.
they just see a moment and they decide to take the chance. And I've got to say, most people that get out of prison get caught relatively soon after, because there's a lot of focus from law enforcement. Obviously, if someone's busted out of jail, it's a humiliation to the corrective services. It's almost waving a red flag at police and corrective services if you've escaped from prison. So a lot of work goes into it. And most people that escape from prison don't spend that long on the other side of the wall before they get caught. But Brenden, for out on the run for 5 years, 5 or 6 years.
5 years, 5 years. Whereas Reynolds, the fella he escaped with, he didn't take long to get caught. And that was showing the difference between two types of crime.
Yeah,
Brenden was the thinker, Reynolds was the opportunist, and not as, I don't think, as had the smarts that Brenden had.
yeah,
And Brenden got rid of Reynolds in the end
yeah,
when he realised he was a liability. And that was one of the things. Brenden was always thinking about staying out.
mm,
Reynolds was always thinking about, well, what can I do next? Because I'm enjoying this life. There was one was a strategic thinker and the other not.
yeah. What sort of things did your assessment of it, and you've been heavily involved in the investigation? What sort of things was Brenden doing that set himself apart in being strategic enough to keep that low profile and slip under the radar?
I think staying on the move and keeping a low profile when he was on the move and doing things that people would normally do. I mean, he went on I think it was a Kentucky tour or a tour through Northern Territory. He met up with a Japanese tourist. They just looked like pals.
Yeah,
They headed off and climbed Uluru Ayers Rock, as it was called then. Did real touristy stuff
yeah,
that didn't draw attention.
mm,
If he did a job, he planned the job and left no trace. Really, most of the stuff he was nailed for is based on his MO,
mm,
and maybe some, caught with some of the items later on. But so he was a thinker,
mm,
and I often said, he thinks like a good detective.
yeah.
He just I'll conceptualize a plan, I'll analyze it, and I'll figure out where this plan's going to go. But I'll always have a plan B and a plan C and a plan D.
And minimise and reduce the risk. You talked about MO. I know when I worked in the armed hold-up squad, I was familiar with Brenden Abbott because it was around that same time when he was on the run. So we were aware in New South Wales that you had a bloke that was travelling around robbing different places. But I remember my work in the armed hold-up squad. The MO was the type of things that you'd link the crimes to. It was the way that people approach it might be the words of what they say when they storm into the bank, what they wear, just their demeanour and the way that they would conduct themselves. What type of bank robber was Brenden? How did he go about when he was in the bank?
Well, he'd start before he was in the bank.
Yeah,
He'd do surveillance. So he knew the setup, he knew who was who. He did a lot of planning. He understood the alarm systems. He was technically pretty adept. He liked tinkering, taking things apart. The family always talked he'd take radios apart and put them back together
Mm.
and so on. So he understood technology. And so he'd do all that groundwork. He'd find out times when things would arrive, when the vault was going to be open, when staff arrived. So a lot of groundwork. So that was before he went in the bank. So when he went in the bank, it was relatively smooth. Whether he came through the ceiling, whether he was already in the bank, or he was coming in through the front door.
Mm.
So he just knew what was going to happen. He was ahead of everyone. Um, a couple of the jobs he'd actually done things to the alarms. He'd put listening devices into various banks to hear who was in there, so he knew what was going on. But then when he went in, unlike some of his people he went with, he was very systematic about
Mm.
what he was doing. I mean, anything that went wrong in the bank usually was one of his co-offenders that
Right.
do something dumb and stupid. And so he would minimize the risk by knowing exactly what was going on.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I think that's what made him apart from other bank robbers. I mean, I worked on a lot of bank robbers.
Mm.
I can remember one, you can see him rushing on the camera going into the bank with his sawn off. But he hasn't put his balaclava on. His nose
Yeah.
is sticking through his eye hole and he runs into the door. You know, this is
Yeah.
this is the type of character you were dealing with.
Yeah.
Whereas Brenden had done his
Yeah.
his, his pre-planning.
So he was on after escaping from Fremantle prison. He's on the run for 5 years. Is that the stage you started looking at it? When
No,
he on that run at that stage, or is this after he
uh,
got locked up again?
No, I started working on him at the end of his
Yeah.
5 years when they
Yep.
were all celebrating. We were getting, we were picking up messages on various people's phones or whatever that, congratulations on your 5 years from a couple who knew the family and so
Yeah.
on. So that's when I picked it up. And that's a real thumbing in the nose. Now, let's talk about thumbing the nose
Mm.
and the postcard.
Yeah.
It's pretty well known now that he didn't send
Send
postcards.
postcards. Yeah.
After he escaped with Reynolds, there was a pursuit, a pretty wild pursuit. 79 Division working nights had got behind him, and he was driving a Cordia. He was driving, and Reynolds was the passenger. And they'd done a break-in on a gun shop and got a couple of shotguns,
Yeah.
um, and obviously to do armed holdups. So when the chase was on, Reynolds was hanging out the window firing a shotgun at the car. The car got dumped in a Perth northern suburb, and Abbott and Reynolds had hidden the shotguns in a sand pile out the
Mm.
front of a house, and then run and hid in the bush. And as we say, went doggo, so they lay still. And of course, the search went on and on and on. They stayed where they were. They weren't picked up. The coppers got pretty close to them apparently,
Mm.
and the by daylight they just made off and got away. Um, but in the car was all their camping gear. They'd been camping out in the bush down and dwelling up. They'd bought a heap of camping gear and so on, and they found a camera, one of those
Yeah.
disposable old cameras, and developed the film. And sure enough, there's Reynolds standing outside the Dwelling Up police station. Um, it looked like a postcard
Yeah.
taken by Abbott. And so that was before I got there. One of the and when I was there, we liked generating publicity because publicity got people talking.
It puts the pressure on someone on the run.
Yes, it
Yeah.
does, and that was one of the main tools we used, and they had been used. So the photographs were released to the press. I think it was the Australasian Post at the time who decided to run the story that was a postcard.
Yep.
We didn't say no because that then got everybody interested.
Yeah.
And that's how the myth of the Postcard Bandit started.
Okay, well, that's interesting. And from a tactical point of view, I understand it too because it puts the pressure, keeps people talking about it, and that makes it hard for someone like Brenden trying to be keeping a low profile. So, how did he actually get caught after the 5 years? What was the catalyst
It was
for that?
Look, I think it was just under 2 years that we worked solidly on him.
Yeah,
We were dealing with other armed robberies all the time and
and
that.
you just reference it again. You said from South Australia, Sid, Detective Sergeant
Thomas,
there, Sid Thomas, and from Queensland.
yeah, Jerry Costello and Glenn Pritchard. Jerry was at Robbers in Brisbane,
Yep,
and Glenn was at Broadbeach CIB at the time, I think it was.
yep,
Um, so we were dealing with them constantly. We had lesser dealings with Northern Territory, um, Victoria, and New South.
yep.
He, you know, any time there was a bank robbery with any imagination, it suddenly became Brenden Abbott.
Yeah, you can get drowned in in
Yeah.
in that.
And look, some of them were, and
Yep,
some of them he was never charged with because we didn't have the evidence. But, Brenden Abbott, every time it was a bank robbery, was it Brenden Abbott?
yeah,
And we were getting sightings in WA. I remember we got contacted by a UCO who was working on a drug job who said that Brenden Abbott had come in on this fella's place.
yeah,
Um, we were never able to confirm that. That was the UCO's identification. Obviously, he didn't say he was Brenden Abbott.
yep.
So there was lots of these rabbit
False.
holes we were
Yeah.
running down. But having decided to work on Glen, we came up with a strategy of what we were going to do.
And
Now
how
we
did
knew,
how just on that? How did that play out for you guys? Like from different states. It sounds like you got the A team together of 3 or 4 obsessed detective sergeants from different locations, and
yep.
it's got to become personal, hasn't it? When you're chasing a bloke that long, and it's not personal in a negative sense, but you got to be driven.
Oh, look, this is, and from being a detective,
Yeah,
that if you get something that really interests you,
yeah,
that's got a bit of teeth, that you don't want to let it go.
yeah,
And so you really push for it. And of course, you also know that from above, hierarchy is saying, hey, pull your head in. That's not the only case you got.
yeah,
You're not getting these resources. You're not getting this. You're not getting that. Focus on. And so you've got to kind of, you butt heads with hierarchy as well,
yeah,
which we did. But working on Glenn, knowing he was driving around while suspended, I decided to run a strategy on him. And we knew what car he had. So what I was going to do was pull him up, leave his car on the side of the road, get him processed through as driving under suspension
mm,
um, in his real name. And then what we had done was did a rehearsal on the same type of vehicle of putting in a listening device
yeah,
and a tracking device.
yeah,
All new technology for the time. So we did that. We knew how long it was going to take us to do it.
mm,
Um, and that was the plan. So anyway, we 79 Division, couple of fellows, Graham Randall and Doug Nelson, who I later worked with Doug at armed robbery when he became a detective. He was in uniform at the time. They pulled up Abbott as part of the plan. Surveillance was on, Salmon. They pulled up Salmon. Surveillance were on him for the moment up until it became an interaction between police and him.
yeah,
So surveillance pulled off, and I'd given these instructions, which were to if he identifies himself as Glenn Salmon, just lock him up. Don't do anything else. Just lock him up for driving at suspension. Leave the car there.
yeah,
We'll deal with it. We'll get the keys and we'll deal with it. So when they pulled him up, Glenn was being a bit shady, and Graham started searching the vehicle. And in the back, he found what looked like a silencer
mm,
to a gun. And so Doug rang me and said, look, we've got him here. He's also produced a false identification, a Northern Territory license. And so I said to him, whatever you do, just let him go because we needed him to be with his real identification. We'll
yeah,
get another chance for it. So he said, yeah, no worries. We'll let him go. In that time, Graham had also found some ammunition, quizzed Abbott about it and Salmon about it, and then Salmon got out a OC spray, a pepper spray,
yeah,
sprayed both in the eyes. A fight started. They were rolling around fighting. Salmon had managed to remove one of the officer's gun from his holster,
right,
had the gun upside down, so he was holding it like
mm,
that, and it was pressed into the stomach of the officer. I'm pretty sure that was Randall. And we saw it later because we could see the whole imprint of the gun in his stomach. And this fight went on for a while. Two coppers blinded.
yeah,
They managed to get the gun out of his hands. throw the gun away. A bystander then picked it up and took it away while they eventually got him into custody.
Mm.
Um, After that, Nelson rang me and I said, you know, did you let him go? What the fuck's going on? And then he told me the story, and I thought, oh,
Yeah.
Jesus. Surveillance had pulled off, so no one was seeing this going on
Mm.
until after it had been resolved. So we made a decision that salmon should just be dealt with as that incident,
Yeah.
not talk about Brenden, not talk about anything. While we got a pager off him,
Yeah.
we found other guns, we found pistols in the car and so on. So we thought we'll follow those leads down while he's in custody and being dealt with. So we knew he would be remaining in custody and let 79 Division deal with that side of it.
Yeah.
We stayed right out of it. Meanwhile, we're then looking at the pager messages and we can see he's got direct links to Brenden,
Yep.
some of the messages. So we worked on it. I think we left it for 24 hours, then had him brought up from Canning Vale remand in shackles.
Mm.
Um, their tactical people shuffled him in. We put him in an interview, and our aim was to try and elicit Brendan's whereabouts from him to give Brenden up, using the fact that we knew that he had a new child coming.
Yeah.
I
Makes
think I
sense.
think the kid had just been born or was about to be born. That he was going to go away for a long, long time unless he helped us. All these negotiation tactics. And over a period of about 5 hours working on it, eventually, and we went through the whole gamble of emotions with him.
Yeah.
And this was a hardened crook who initially didn't want to talk to us, to the fact that, okay, I'll give you a post office box. And
Okay.
his thinking was that he would be able to get to Brenden
And
as
warn
soon as
him.
he got back to the position to warn him not to use the post
Yeah.
office box. So as soon as we got that detail, straight on the phone to Queensland, they went straight down, raided the post office, got into the post office box, found a bill for an address on the Gold Coast, set up surveillance opposite this high rise, which
Yeah.
was quite a high up in the thing, and we're watching directly across. And sure enough, there's Brenden. I think they told me he was naked, ironing shirts and so
Yeah.
on. Meanwhile, we let Salmon go back to prison. He was dealt with all that. He was very unhappy with us. We got a message shortly after saying on the thing that the page is off, Dirty Girl is off. So in other words, Kelly's off.
Yep.
And so he got a warning that we'd already set up for surveillance.
Yep.
They saw him go downstairs carrying a couple of bags. He was wearing his bum bag because he was always known to be armed.
Mm.
And in the bum bag was always a pistol. And they were kind of caught off-footed because things were moving very fast, but they had a surveillance guy down below. So everybody's charging downstairs. The surveillance guy's moving towards him. And I later spoke to Brenden and he thought he was about to be mugged. The surveillance guy pulls
Yeah.
out his gun, points it at Brenden. Brenden thinks, have I got time to get to my gun? He hasn't. He lies down and he's arrested.
Yep.
And the cavalry come in. That's the summary of the arrest and how that first arrest happened.
Yeah. It's interesting, a couple of points there, and I think people will be fascinated about what goes on in the negotiations when you arrest someone or you're dealing with them in an interview room, and you talked about with Glen Salmon, Brendan's brother, how the thing that you had to negotiate was how long he was going to spend in prison, and a young family, and they're the type of things I think that's fair on the table. That's just the realities of the world. In the type of crimes that these guys are involved in, and these are the type of things that police officers have to bargain with, and quite
Yeah.
appropriately, I would suggest.
Well, we had raided his house the night before.
Mm.
So the next day he was brought into us. That night after the incident, we raided his house, found all sorts of stuff.
Mm.
We found uh, a picture on a wall of a blank driver's license for Northern Territory and Western Australia. And so you'd stand in front of it. They'd add in the
Right.
detail,
Okay.
take
Yep.
the photo. Suddenly you've got,
You
and
got your
then reduce it
license.
down. We found a stolen police ID. We found pistols with silencers. We found a taser.
Mm.
I later found out that he'd used the taser on himself to see what it was like,
Right.
and it took him about a day to recover. It was one of those ones, the old style, that had about
Yeah.
120,000 bolts go through it.
Bit of a kick.
Um, it was a very long interview. There was two of us. Another detective, Steve Drown, a very good detective. We were bouncing off him. We weren't doing so much good cop, bad cop, but
Yep.
you know, you have to tailor how you speak to someone
Mm.
when you're interviewing them, and so it took some time, and to get that post office box. I think Glenn was thinking, I'll give you that, and I'll be able to solve the problem
Yeah.
because I'll be able to warn Brenden, not realizing how quickly and how prepared we were to move.
Yeah. Well, how did you guys collectively as a team, all the people looking for Brenden feel when he was taken into custody?
I think there were a few beers to be had, mate,
Yeah. Yeah.
as should be.
Yep.
I mean, I was pretty well on the plane very quickly because we had stuff we wanted to talk to him about,
Yep.
and you want to get in there as quick as you can. By this stage, he was at Waco prison.
Yep.
Sid Thomas came up from South Australia, so Jerry, Sid, and I went to Waco prison to interview him. It's funny, when we went into the prison, they said they had an interview room for him, and Abbott was in the corridor, um, standing up against the wall, and he just did not even acknowledge us, wouldn't even look at us. Um, I think Jerry had already spoken to him, so there
Yep.
was at least some recognition that there was an association there. And so he was into an interview room, and over the next 2 hours, we went from nothing to talking about the cricket.
Right.
And it was really an interesting 2 hours. I mean, there was three of us, so I went there with pretty well no expectation he was ever going to cop to anything,
Yeah.
but we still had to ask.
Hmm.
Um, and I wanted to hear what he had to say, but probably more likely he wanted to know what
What
we
you had.
knew and how he was caught.
Yeah.
And of course, we weren't going to tell him that either.
Yeah.
So it was a bit of a cat and mouse, talking about what was going on, about how things had happened and so on. But from my perspective, for any crimes that he committed in WA, it was a non. With that, he wasn't going to confess to anything.
Yeah.
And we had the identifications had been tainted by newspaper articles.
Mm.
We'd found that an identification of Brenden had been done at earlier stages um, by showing the witness a newspaper article of Brenden Abbott with the headline um, "Suspect for that
Yeah.
bank holdup." Well, that's going to go nowhere.
You've blown that for the courts.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we really had nothing, and my view was that by that stage, unless he was going to give us anything, he was going to do a long stretch in Queensland anyway,
Yeah.
and likely a stretch in Adelaide.
So did they
So
have it? Did they have him for? Well, you've got him for Western Australia for escape custody, but did they have him for other jobs? They had him
yeah,
locked in
they had
because
him for jobs in Queensland. There was stuff they had. They had good CCTV.
yeah.
So he was charged. He fought every charge every step of the way. And that came out later on when all the committal hearings were occurring in the Gold
Oh, so
Coast.
he contested he charged for robbing
Everything.
the Commonwealth Bank. Oh, I'm pleading not guilty and fired at the trial.
Yep.
Yep.
And Chris Nist was his lawyer. And I have to say, yeah, he was obviously good counsel and
He could
gave
have this
every
watertight
copper
brief
a
and
run for his
yeah.
money. Yeah, and really, as far as the charges he was on, I had a very small part in it, and
Mm.
I still copped.
It,
As you do. In
it's
those days, we did. We
yeah.
expected to get a hard time.
It was a different world, and you got ripped apart. And a
Yep.
good defence barrister or solicitor just seemed to have open slather on you. They could just question everything. You get out of the witness box sometimes, and you're not even sure if your name is actually Glen Potter.
Well, that's right. I
Yeah,
mean, but I think also we come from a time when I used to enjoy court.
yeah,
It was, it was a contest.
yes, yeah.
Whereas these days, no one goes to court anymore.
Well,
No one
the
gives it.
evidence was different from the evidence you gather now. Sometimes the evidence that we get with electronic CCTV, links to phones and all that, it's overwhelming
Yeah.
by the time it's presented at court. Quite often it was when you were taking people to court for the stick-ups back in those days, it was identification. You might get lucky and have a fingerprint on or hair in an abandoned balaclava or something like that.
Yep.
So, yeah, I can imagine it. I'm just interested in the psyche of him, speaking to him shortly after. And you said, 2 hours you spend with him, he starts to talk cricket. Did he have, was it like, I would imagine life on the run would be a very stressful situation. You'd have to be hyper alert the whole time. Was there a sense of relief, or did he still come across as a caged animal?
Caged animal. He did not want to be there.
Yeah,
Yeah, I sensed that he was going to get out. He was going to try and get
right.
out.
Okay.
There
Yep.
was no way he was going to go, oh, well, you've got me now. It's a fair cop. And that came from the fact that he was trying to elicit information from us.
Right.
He wanted to know everything, not just how he got caught, but what we knew, what offences he'd committed. Um, he was only going to tell us, and he only told us what we had absolute proof on.
Yep.
He talked about a radio he got out of the police academy in Adelaide
Yep.
and laughed about that. He didn't tell us who got that for him,
Yeah.
but he had a police
Oh,
radio.
police radio. Okay.
Yeah. So it was a very interesting discussion. And I remember afterwards listening, because they had LDs, listening devices in, and I can say this now, in the visitors' rooms
Yeah.
at the time for Abbott, and the family were in there. And the family, he told his brother to get up to Cairns and deal with his safe house or safe
Yeah.
workshop or whatever it was up there. So Queensland got onto that pretty quick. The family weren't involved with his, apart from
Yep.
Glenn. And also people talk about how much money he'd stolen. There's talk of in $1-2 million. At that time, it was a lot of money.
Yeah.
And but how expensive it is to be on the run like he was. Everywhere was, cost him. Cost him through paying people off, cost him through hotels, cars, travel. He was flying business class around the country, doing his jobs. He'd put on a suit and looked like a businessman with a wig. He was doing disguises. Everything he did cost him a lot of money. And quite frankly, even if he has money stashed away now, currency has changed. You can't do anything with it.
$1 million. Yeah.
Yes, and the denominations, the notes have all changed now. You walk into a bank with a whole lot of those old notes.
It'd
What's
be
the first thing that's going to
hard press
happen?
someone trying to pass off $2, $10 notes and
Yeah,
and
you might
whatnot.
as well burn it because
Yeah.
it's worthless. So to say he's got a lot of money now and
Did you
no.
recover his disguises or the fake passports and different things? Did
we
you find the stash of those
when we
documents?
raided Glenn's house, we
Yeah.
found a stash.
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure Queensland found a fair bit of gear too
Yeah.
to cover that. Um, it's funny, when it got to that stage of who'd caught him,
Yeah.
things kind of retracted
Yeah.
in that we start, oh, it's ours now. You
Yeah.
can get your hands on in 10 years time, but this is ours now.
Yeah.
But if they wanted our help, oh yeah, we
Yeah,
had to help.
I know
And
that's the nature of the policing.
the beast, yeah.
How did you guys feel like collectively before you sort of withdrew? You thought that's the end of it. We've got him. You get it through court. You know he's going to get a lengthy sentence. Did you think that was the last you'd be thinking or hearing of Brenden Abbott?
There was always something in the back of my mind that maybe he'd have another crack again.
Yeah,
But then when I saw the security he was under, I thought, geez,
yeah,
he's going to have to walk through walls to get out of there. Well, he almost did, didn't he?
yeah. Well, tell us about that. How long he was in before he escaped again?
Um, I think from memory it was about 2 years.
Yeah,
And I'd at this stage gone back to TRG as a uniformed senior sergeant.
yep.
I got promoted to senior sergeant and went to TRG, which is our tactical unit.
Tactical teams. Yep.
And so I was working out of there and I got a phone call and said, he's gotten out. We need to look at your security. So they looked at my security. I've never been concerned by that because I think, coppers, anyone who's got any brains is not going to go after a copper
Very rare.
because it's
Yeah,
just going to bring a lot of heat on you.
yeah,
But you as a copper, as a detective, you've always been security conscious anyway.
yeah.
So I learnt about that, and then I knew that they'd started another investigation here. And as it turns out, Brendan had come across to WA, did a stick up on Mirrabooka Bank, um, and I ended up running a team chasing what was a sighting around Yanchep Way for him, but I think that's he pretty well got stayed out of WA apart
Yeah,
from that
yeah.
one job. Um,
How
yeah,
how
so
how long was he on the run for the second time?
6 months.
Yep.
Um, look, and they had the cooperation was certainly better between states by this stage.
Yeah.
They'd gotten their act together. The National Crime Authority existed now, and so they were involved in it as well. Um, and you were getting sightings all around the country. I remember I got asked to go into because I was one of the last coppers in
Yeah.
WA to speak with him,
Yeah.
and they wanted me to listen to a phone call they thought may have been him. And I did listen. I went in there, listened to the phone call, and I think it was up in far north Queensland. And yeah, it did sound like him.
Mm.
And I said, yeah, that sounds like him. And and so yeah, so there was I was brought in on that. I think Northern Territory said no, it wasn't him on that phone call. He was in Northern Territory the whole
Yeah.
time, which is fine. Interestingly, during that period, um, we got a information from um, I think over east, that Abbott has been seen boarding a plane coming to WA,
Right.
and they were absolutely convinced it was him. Um, and so we'd set up an operation to meet the plane when it came here, and I was in TRG, but I was also the last person who actually had visual
Yeah.
identification of them. So we had people along the way saying, yeah, it's definitely him, definitely him. We were sitting at the base of the escalators on the other side of a one-way glass door. We had TRG teams, everything. They were all going to pounce on this guy coming down the escalator. And of course, so I'm sitting there looking, waiting for him. And then they said, that's him coming down the escalator. And I said, no, it's not. It's not him. It's definitely not him. Didn't even look anything like him.
Oh no. Yeah.
And they pounced on him, and it wasn't him. But this is this is the level people were operating now. We
Yeah.
were seeing Brenden Abbott everywhere.
Yeah.
So
Well, that's yeah, what he's shown before, like escaping 5 years on the run, robbed how many banks, and caused the chaos that he did. Then he's back in and released again. I know from my experience in the stick ups armed hold up squad, Christopher Binns. He went by the moniker of Badness, Christopher Badness Binns. He escaped from a Victorian prison, came up to New South Wales, robbed a bank. We locked him up for that. You know, a high risk arrest. He robbed the Commonwealth Bank at Chatswood, I think it was. We put him away and yeah, charged him with all the offences we were aware of, and he escaped from Victoria. But then he was in prison here in Parramatta, then escaped again, and I know the pressure that put on everyone to find him before he was put away. So yeah, you've got these people that you can't break. They're always looking for an opportunity to get out of prison, aren't they?
yeah, and of course they're always looking for the gaps in our
Mm.
capabilities, and that's how Brendan operated. I mean, when it came to the second escape, he'd work out what the gaps were in the security and how he could take advantage of it. And I think that is the more interesting escape is the second escape
Yeah,
because he really, in my mind, really strategized so many things that would make life take advantage of the gaps and make life very hard for police to find him afterwards.
and how the prison he escaped, that second one. I think in my research it's talked about he had some stuff smuggled into the prison to cut through the bars. What's a diamond string, or what is it
A
called?
diamond wire.
Yeah.
He so what he was eventually let into the general prison population,
Mm.
which straight away it's the opportunities to watch what's going on and find the gaps. So he got diamond wire smuggled in via an antenna of a radio, little transistor radio they used to
Mm.
have at the time. They searched obviously the radio, but no one thought that He'd put diamond wire into an antenna. So he'd got that into the prison. You just can't hold diamond wire and do that. You
Yeah.
had to work out and make a handle for it.
Yeah.
And I think got a handle off a bit of furniture. And so he'd made a handle to slowly cut through the bars of his cell. But of course, going by himself makes him an easier target than unless he gets four other guys to go with him. There was a fellow in the prison, a guy by the name of Brendan Bereshon, who befriended Abbott while he was in the general population. And Bereshon was obviously enamored with Brenden Abbott. He had a celebrity
Yeah.
status, which both worked for him and against him. You know what prison's like.
Yeah.
You cut down the tall poppy as well. So Bereshon was due for parole and got parole and offered his services to Abbott. And so there was a plan that when the time was right, he would, obviously source the diamond wire, that he would assist in the escape. And so the plan came together. They had Brendan had cut through his bars with the diamond wire. He'd gone down the line, past two other ones, four other prisoners, two murderers, and I think two rapists. So they were bad buggers.
Mm.
And they, at all the same time, had a plan that Bereshon would be outside to assist him with bolt cutters being thrown over. To if there was any armed response from the armed response vehicle, he would pin that vehicle down using a rifle, which he did. And so when the signal was given that it was all clear to go, there were signals for either flashing lights or dropping burning paper out to say it was out the cell window to say it was a go. The operation, their part started. There were flaws in the prison system because of lack of staffing, because of changeover in staffing and so on. So they were through the bars. They had joined a bunch of plastic chairs together. So once they were out in the first area where the first lot of wire is, these plastic chairs were melded together and formed a bridge over the first wire. They reached the bolt cutters, got through the second wire. When the response vehicle started trundling up, an armored response vehicle, Bereshon started putting rounds into the vehicle, so that stopped. So that stopped their ability to respond. In the meantime, the prisoners are making their way out and gone. Bereshon and Abbott went off in their own direction. The other four went off by themselves. Abbott was never going to run with them because they knew he was going to get them caught. And then started the next escape. And I think they lay low in the mangroves for quite some time before they then got clothes and got on their way, while the other four created merry hell around Queensland, doing what crooks who have been locked up for a while, going to brothels, causing problems in pubs and this type of thing, which then took the attention or reduced the attention on Brenden Abbott.
Yeah.
It was pretty smart.
Tracking those. How was he caught on the run for 5 months?
5 or 6 months. He was up in Northern Territory in Darwin. He was caught coming out of a laundromat.
Right.
The coppers got a tip off and grabbed him out the front of that.
Right.
Cheeky bugger at the end of it said, "Can you finish my laundry for me?" as he was loading into the car.
I don't like to give him respect, but there is something that you think you're going to rattle them with a shotgun pointed to the head, and when they just throw back something like that, are you going to pick up my laundry? It's
pretty cool.
Yeah,
because that's then when the next stage started, the constant isolation, solitary, and that's when it became a political football, both in Queensland and WA. WA for losing him the first time, and very much a political football. I think the opposition used to shout out in Parliament, "Where's Brenden Abbott?" That blame was being politically heaped on the government of the day for not being able to keep him in. So what's going to happen? No politician is going to, no attorney general or whatever is going to say, "Oh, just put him in the main prison population."
Yeah,
he's going to be in solitary for years.
And is it true that he's one of the longest serving prisoners for solitary confinement?
I think so. I mean, I'd be guessing.
Past, but
I don't. Yeah. But look, I think he did 6 years pretty well in solitary first up. Yeah. And I once said, try and spend 24 hours by yourself.
Yeah, it's tough and inhumane. They're put in there for a reason, and obviously there would have been a lot of pressure. And I know, quite rightly, corrective services don't take kindly when someone's escaped their custody, and the police don't like putting people before the courts, having sentenced to prison. So there's a lot of people that he would have impacted on. And also, and we haven't spoken about it, but it's obvious, and we'll just touch on it so people understand that we get it. It's not glorifying these crimes. That these crimes, you've worked in the Armed Hold Up Squad. I've worked in the Armed Hold Up Squad. We've spent a lot of time sitting down, getting statements from victims that have been traumatised when someone puts a gun to their head. Has a lasting effect. Quite often, people think, well, there's no physical harm, but the psychological harm that it causes people, it destroys some life. So we do understand that. Would you agree with that
I
sentiment?
I absolutely agree, and Brennan deserved everything he got. As
Yeah,
far as I mean, a minimum term of imprisonment for an armed robbery would be 6 years.
yeah,
He carried out a lot of armed robberies. That a lot of people's lives were destroyed or traumatized,
yeah.
um, and and so he deserved his
Mm.
sentences. I think the way the sentences were carried out were probably, you know, prison authorities are always understaffed.
Yeah,
They're, it's not a vote winner for governments to maintain prisons at a high level. I mean, prisoners even today are left in solitary because there's not enough guards constantly.
mm.
You know, it's not something that wins votes. So there's two sides to that coin. Yes, he deserved to be in prison. He deserved to do the time, probably what he got.
Yeah,
Um, it's the manner in which it's done,
mm.
which I tend to have a bit of a conflict over. The thought of someone being in solitary, either 24 or 23 hours a day, that's just cruel.
Oh, it is inhumane. It's inhumane when the impact it has, and people argue, well, they're in prison, but I've spoken to a lot of people who've spent time in there, and when you break it down, what's going through and what they're going through,
Yeah.
there's a reason that there's restrictions on that type of treatment. Where is he at now? Is he's still in prison? Um,
He's at Casuarina prison in WA. He's he's actually been doing a lot of his own legal
yeah.
work, and I mean he's had a lot of time on his hands. He's no dummy.
How long has
So
he actually served up until this point in time?
I think 33 years
Yeah, it's
all
a
up.
long time. Yeah,
It's a long time. And look, I have said that murderers get less, but as is quite rightly pointed out to me, most murderers commit their offence at 30 minutes of madness,
yeah.
whereas he was calculating,
Conscious
needed
decision.
money, conscious, planned, and did that. So again, I think I don't have an issue with the
Mm.
sentence. Um, so he's at Casuarina. He's fighting through the courts to have his releases sorted. He's just gone through a Supreme Court hearing. It's come back that he will serve his time,
Mm.
which I think takes him up to 2030. But he also, his parole date is now 2028. So, it's 2 and a bit years away now.
Okay. So
Um, so after 33 years, sorry, 2 years is probably waitable. He was originally going to be then extradited to South Australia because they had a warrant in existence for his arrest over there. That was a 35-year-old
yeah,
robbery. Um, that warrant was stopping him from getting any rehabilitation, maintaining his status in maximum security here, because he then had to go on that. And I was asked to co-sign a letter saying that the warrant should be quashed
yeah,
because it's not in the public interest. And I think that we let too many prisoners out without any rehabilitation.
yep.
And what do they do? The only thing they know
They're
is
going to
crime.
fall back into their life of
You
crime.
know, yes, he might commit crimes again, but he deserves to have some training and rehabilitation. So after a lot of thought and a lot of soul searching, I put my name to that.
Yeah,
The warrant was withdrawn by the Attorney General in that state. I don't think Sid was very happy with me, and I can understand
yeah,
Sid would not be happy, and some of my colleagues weren't either.
yeah.
But it's a case I've followed, and it's not because it's Brenden Abbott. It's because I do believe in proper rehabilitation as well as incarceration.
Yeah.
And yeah, so I signed it, and so he doesn't have to go to South Australia. So
Well, I
after he's released here,
yeah.
that's the end of it.
I respect you for that, Glenn, and it's hard because as a police officer, we're often thought to look at things in black and white, and yeah, well, he's a bad guy, we're good guys, he should get the punishment. But I understand what you're saying, but I also understand that the costs it would, yeah, you've made an informed decision or a conscious decision on what's the right thing. I not relating to Brendan's case, but other cases where someone's serving a custodial sentence in Queensland, knowing that as soon as they're released from Queensland, New South Wales are sitting there with a warrant and they're going to get another 10 years. I don't see the benefit of that. If someone's in custody, may as well have them all dealt with and say there's
Yes.
something to aim for. Otherwise, I can see why people are going, well, fuck this. I've got no chance of rehabilitation. Let me out and I'm going to fall back into my old ways.
Yeah, because that's all they know. And
Yeah,
of course, institutionalization in prisons, they everything's laid on for them.
yeah,
Where do you buy your toothpaste? How do you get a toothbrush?
yeah.
Shopping. If you don't, and of course the world has changed in 30 odd years,
Oh,
you know,
remarkably. Yeah,
it's going to be a shock to him.
yeah,
Fortunately, he's got a family, a son that wants to take him under his wing. But, there is a risk of letting people out like Brenden.
yeah.
There is a
Well,
risk he might.
I got to speak, and I'm sure you got to speak with his son at that premiere, and he presents as. Well, I met him for 5 minutes. He seems on the surface like a decent young fella that hasn't had his father in his life. I wanted to ask on the night because I had you both on stage, and I just didn't want to ask the question where you don't know the answer to. What's your relationship like with Brendan's son? When you caught up in matters like that?
Look, it's a little bit awkward.
Yeah,
It is a little bit awkward. But having said that, he seems like a stand-up young fella. I don't know him that well. Um, I think it's awkward for both of us. I'm
yeah,
part of the reason why he hasn't had a father. And as he said on stage, if we'd caught him earlier, he wouldn't have been born.
yeah,
So,
yeah,
you know,
and he's got a
yeah,
sense of humour too. Yeah,
swings and
yeah,
roundabouts.
yeah,
But yeah. So, and I've often said I'm not any of their friends.
yeah,
I respect their privacy, their lives. I respect prisoners after they're released; they've done their time, and I would respect that his son has James has a good relationship with his father, and good on him and good luck to
yeah,
him.
yeah,
It's funny, after that, the next night after that premiere, I was having a few drinks with the cast, and James turned up,
yeah,
and I'm sitting talking to one of the members of the cast, and he passes me a phone. I go, all right, hello. He said, hello. I thought, I know who this is.
yeah,
It's Brenden.
yeah,
And that was an awkward conversation because,
yeah,
you know, I said, you know who I am, don't you? He
yeah,
said, yeah, I know who you are. I said, well, let's get this out of the way
yeah,
straight up. Look, yeah, I there's no ill will on my part.
yeah.
I hope life goes really well for you. I hope you get out when you get out and have a great life and a great relationship. Yeah, this is really awkward.
Yeah. No,
But he laughed about it. He was good about it.
well, you
Yeah.
you got to laugh.
Yeah.
It's yeah, awkward, but what are you to do? And it's just a sort of surreal situation that you found yourself in. It's bizarre, but look, we
On
might,
that point,
yeah.
sorry, I just looked up when I was on the phone, looked up. There's about four different camera phones on me.
Oh, right,
And I
okay.
go, oh, this
Oh
could
no,
just
you don't.
end.
Yeah,
This, yeah,
yeah. You don't want that on the front page.
no.
We might take a break here. I just wanted to cover off on Brendan's case and your involvement because I find it fascinating. But we haven't finished with you yet because when we get back, you've got a lot more stories. I don't know. I think it's something about Western Australian types. There's always some stories. Want
Well,
to
they call us
want
wait a while here, mate.
yeah, yeah. I want to talk about the murder of or suspected murder of Wayne Drewitt, which is a fascinating case. your time as a negotiator and different things, and how you got your injuries. That's just for starters. And perhaps for our question, is there one that's got away? One case that you think of that you wish you could have resolved. But we'll cover all that in part two.
Excellent, mate. Look, and I'm glad you touched on the one that got away, because that is a story and a half.
Okay, look forward to it. Cheers.
All right. Thanks, Gary.